I will never forget that day. A tent cut open from the inside, bodies frozen solid in the bitter cold, and that same eerie radioactive glow on their clothes. The investigation lasted months, but the verdict was singular. An overwhelming force. I didn't realize then that it was just the beginning. This is a story where almost everything is officially documented, yet almost nothing is explained. And it's just one of many. Today, I want to delve into history's darkest, most unsettling and still unexplained mysteries. Mysteries that drive scientists mad, stir the imagination, and make me ask what on earth really happened. Prepare yourselves. Today, I invite you on a journey through time to the deepest historical enigmas that still haunt our minds. Mysteries that have given rise to conspiracy theories for decades. But as I always say, where there's smoke, there's fire. At the heart of every such story lie real facts and discoveries. And my task today is to unravel what in these famous mysteries is true and what is merely a clever fabrication. And we will start with the incredible story of a planet whose name sounds like a warning. Nibiru. Imagine this, almost 5,000 years ago, in the very heart of Mesopotamia, that same Tigris and Euphrates valley we know today as Iraq, a civilization emerged whose legacy still amazes me. These were the Sumerians, one of the earliest and I would say shockingly highly organized cultures in human history. It was they who laid the foundations of writing, architecture, urban life, created the first laws, and most importantly for our story gave the world the foundation of astronomy. The Sumerians erected the first known cities, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur. Each was not merely a settlement, but an independent state with its own laws, its own army, markets, and, of course, a temple. The temple, or as they called it, Egal, the House of the Great One, was much more than just a religious structure. It served simultaneously as an economic, judicial, scientific, and educational center. Records were kept at the temples, invaluable archives stored, scribes trained, and critically important, meticulous observations of natural and celestial cycles were conducted. In these temple schools, future priests and officials were educated. Their main task was not only to maintain order on earth, but also to unwaveringly and meticulously observe the sky. For the Sumerians, everything that happened on earth, from harvests to wars, was a direct reflection of the god's will, expressed through the movements of the stars, planets, and the moon. From those distant times, tens of thousands of clay tablets, covered in mysterious cuneiform, have reached us. Among them are economic documents, court rulings, great literary epics, medical recipes, and, of course, detailed astronomical tables. The most important for our story, I believe, are the texts found in the famous library of Ashurbanipal, the powerful king of Assyria, in his capital Nineveh. This library was excavated in 1849 by archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, and today its treasures are housed in the British Museum. Among these tablets is the famous double tablet Mulapin. It dates to the 6th century BCE, but it records observations spanning at least 7 centuries. Just imagine, this tablet is not a myth, not a legend, but a genuine scientific catalog of antiquity. It describes in detail the movements of the sun, moon, visible planets, seasonal stars, star clocks, and even contains agricultural recommendations based on celestial cycles. This is, in essence, humanity's first stellar encyclopedia. The Sumerians and their successors, the Babylonians, accurately knew 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These planets could be observed with the naked eye. They were called wandering stars. In contrast to the fixed celestial bodies, each planet was associated with a specific deity. Venus with Ishtar, Mars with Nergal, Jupiter with Marduk. The movements of these bodies were meticulously tracked, recorded in tables, and predictions, both astronomical and astrological, were made based on their trajectories. And amidst all these complex astronomical terms, a special word appears, Nibiru, or in Akkadian, Nibiru. Its root is linked to the meaning of crossing, passage, place of intersection. This word appears in mythological, astronomical, and even calendar texts, but its meaning has always been ambiguous. In some cases, Nibiru denotes a specific point in the sky, the intersection of the celestial equator and the ecliptic. In others, a specific star. In the Enuma Elish myth, the Babylonian creation narrative, it is stated, Marduk established Nibiru in the sky as the star by which the gods travel. It monitors the paths of celestial bodies to ensure they do not stray from their course. In other texts, Nibiru is associated with Jupiter, especially at moments of its culmination when it rises highest above the horizon. Tablet 6174, discovered among Assyrian archives, mentions that the appearance of Nibiru is associated with changes. Some researchers, including the well-known Sumerologist Wayne Horowitz, indicated that in the context of these texts, Nibiru might not have been a specific celestial body, but rather a celestial reference point, a kind of guidepost by which the movements of other celestial bodies were structured. It could have been part of a complex coordinate system, not an independent object. And most importantly, in no Sumerian or Babylonian text is Nibiru described as a planet, let alone one with an orbit extending beyond our solar system. Such a concept simply did not exist for the ancients. Nevertheless, in the 20th century, the name Nibiru acquired an entirely different meaning. In 1976, writer Zecharia Sitchin published the book The 12th Planet. In it he claimed to have allegedly deciphered Sumerian tablets and found mentions of a planet that visits the solar system once every 3,600 years. Moreover, according to him, this planet was inhabited by the Anunnaki, powerful extraterrestrials who, he asserted, created humanity. He claimed that the Sumerians knew not only about 9 planets, but also about 12 celestial bodies, including the sun and moon. As proof, he even presented an image supposedly of the solar system from ancient tablets. However, none of these arguments, my friends, withstand serious scientific scrutiny. The tablet BA 243 to which he referred does not depict the solar system. It is merely a geometric motif, nothing more. His translations categorically do not match official academic translations of Sumerian texts, and most of his claims are based on conjecture, not facts. Assyriologists, philologists, archaeologists, including William Hello, Robert Simpson, and Michael Heiser, have thoroughly analyzed Sitchin's works and reached an unambiguous conclusion. This is not history, nor linguistics, nor archaeology. This is, unfortunately, pseudoscience. Despite this, his books became incredibly popular. The idea of the planet Nibiru infiltrated popular culture and began actively spreading online in the early 2000s. And before 2012, the myth of Nibiru resurfaced, this time combined with erroneous interpretations of the Mayan calendar. This spawned a widespread wave of anxiety. Nibiru was dubbed the Apocalypse Planet, a harbinger of the end of the world. This story became so prominent that even NASA was forced to issue an official rebuttal, explaining, "No planet with such parameters has been detected, observed, or exists." However, almost simultaneously, a completely different but no less captivating idea emerged in real astronomy. In 2016, scientists Michael Brown and Konstantin Batygin published mathematical calculations suggesting that a massive 9th planet might indeed exist somewhere beyond Neptune's orbit. It has not been directly observed, but its existence is inferred from anomalies in the movement of so-called trans-Neptunian objects. This hypothetical planet was conditionally named Planet 9, and despite the seeming coincidence, believe me, it has no relation whatsoever to Nibiru. Thus we find ourselves facing 2 realities. The first is scientific. This includes archaeological findings, authentic texts, real observations, and rigorous historical context. The second is cultural. Myths, fantasies, popular but unconfirmed versions. But one thing is important. The Sumerians did indeed study the stars carefully and with astonishing precision. They searched the sky for patterns, rhythms, and signs. Their observations formed the basis of all subsequent astronomy. And though Nibiru was never a planet, its name became a symbol of humanity's yearning for mystery, for explaining the unknown. And perhaps that is why, even after millennia, we continue to ask ourselves, what exactly did the Sumerians see in the night sky? We just spoke of Nibiru, a cosmic image that became a symbol of humanity's yearning for mystery. But mysteries are not found only in the stars. Some lie right beneath our feet, hidden in the snows, among silent mountains and eerie trees. These are stories where everything is too tangible to be fiction, and too illogical to be explained. One such story happened in 1959 in the northern Urals. A group of 9 tourists, experienced and prepared, simply went on a hike and never returned. Their tent was found cut open from the inside. Their bodies were disfigured, some unclothed, with strange injuries. Traces of radiation were found on their clothes. The investigation lasted 3 months, and then a staggering conclusion. Death resulted from the action of an overwhelming force. Decades of silence followed. This is a story where almost everything is officially documented, yet almost nothing is explained. I will try to understand who these people were, what happened to them, and why, after more than 60 years, we still don't know exactly what occurred at Dyatlov Pass. The members of that group were not casual tourists. They were hardened, disciplined individuals who had undertaken many expeditions and seen much. All of them were from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were between 20 and 27 years old. Almost all possessed an engineering mindset with significant climbing experience and a deep knowledge of routes and safety procedures. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a fifth-year student, a radio engineer, and a calm, reliable leader by nature. He designed radio receivers himself, pioneered complex ski routes, led expeditions, and knew exactly how to maintain discipline in the most challenging conditions. His loyal friends accompanied him. Georgy Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Nikolai Thibault-Brinols, Zenaida Kolmogorova. All had impressive trekking experience and were certified for routes of the highest difficulty category. The group also included Lyudmila Dubinina, one of the few women daring enough to undertake winter expeditions. She was only 21 years old. She had already participated in a route where a person died and knew how to act in critical situations. One of the older members of the group was Semyon Zolotaryov. He was an outsider, joining at the last moment. He was already 37 years old. He had a military past and service experience. He taught at a DOSAAF school and knew perfectly well how to behave in difficult conditions. His personality is one of the most mysterious in this case. Together, they formed a cohesive team where everyone knew their role and trusted each other. They were not novices. This was a well-coordinated, physically resilient group with a clear plan, extensive experience, and an approved route. And this, my friends, makes everything that happened next even more incomprehensible. The group set out on their hike on January 27, 1959. They were last seen in the village of Vizay. From there, they sent a telegram and began moving towards Mount Otorten. On February 1st, they set up camp on the slope of the neighboring Kholat Syakhl mountain. It was not the safest location, an open slope, strong winds, but apparently they couldn't descend further before nightfall. After that, complete silence. They were supposed to make contact on February 12th, but no news arrived. The search operation began on February 20th. On the 26th, the tent was found standing on a slope partially covered in snow. It was cut open from the inside. Inside lay warm clothes, food, documents, an axe, and footwear. Tracks leading from the tent went downhill towards the forest. Some were barefoot, some in just socks, in -30 degrees Celsius. A few days later, bodies were found. The first 5 were closer to the forest. 2 were near a campfire. 3 on the way back to the tent. The remaining 4 were only discovered in May under the snow in a ravine deeper in the forest. They were less clothed but had the most horrific injuries. Dubinina had multiple rib fractures, soft tissue damage, and a missing tongue. Zolotaryov had a crushed chest. Thibault-Brinols had a severe skull injury. Experts noted, such injuries are only possible from the impact of very high force, but without visible external injuries, as if from an explosion or a fall from a great height. Traces of radiation were found on Krivonishenko's and Zolotarev's clothes. The level exceeded natural background radiation by 2 or 3 times. The source was not identified. Later, this was explained by Krivonishenko having previously worked at the Chelyabinsk -40 nuclear facility. But this is just one of the theories. No one else had radiation. The investigation lasted 3 months. On May 28, 1959, the case was closed. The official conclusion stated, death resulted from the action of an overwhelming force. This marked the beginning of the most famous unexplained tragedy in Soviet history. When investigators began analyzing the scene, it immediately became clear to me. This was not just an accident. There were too many details that simply didn't fit into a logical sequence. Let's start with the tent. It stood on an open mountain slope, exposed to wind and icing. Yet, just 1.5 kilometers below, the forest began, a much more sheltered and evidently convenient place for an overnight stay. Why experienced tourists chose this spot remains a mystery to this day. The tracks leading from the tent were clearly visible in the deep snow. They headed towards the forest parallel, but in disarray. Some were clear, others intermittent. One of the tracks, as noted in the searchers' reports, went separately from the rest. This led me to assume that the group was disorganized, or perhaps gripped by panic at the time of evacuation. Near the tree where Krivonishenko's and Doroshenko's bodies were later found, thick branches were broken off at a height of about 3 meters. This is confirmed by photos and testimonies. It is believed that the tourists tried to climb the pine tree, possibly to survey their surroundings or gather dry branches. But in the conditions of night cold and loss of clothing, such behavior seems desperate. The distribution of clothing among the participants also raises questions. On the bodies of the least affected, there were fragments of items belonging to others. This suggests that in their final moments, the living tried to warm the dying. But it remains unclear why the most severe injuries were sustained by those who were least protected. The bodies found in the spring in the ravine lay close together, huddled against each other. One of the search participants, Yevgeny Maslenikov, later recalled that one of the deceased was in a crawling position. This is not reflected in the protocols, but such details appear in his reports. These same recollections mention that one of the deceased had an empty sheet of paper clutched in their hand. This episode did not make it into the official materials, but is mentioned in interviews with some search participants. There is no confirmation of this document. Regarding the cuts on the tent, it is known for certain. They were made from the inside with a knife in several places. This was established by expert examination. But in the unofficial recollections of one of the search participants, Mikhail Sharavin, there is an assertion that the tent appeared to have been repitched. He believed it might have been set up by someone after the incident. This version was not reflected in the case materials, but was actively discussed among researchers. Among the group's personal belongings, a camera was found that was not officially listed as belonging to any participant. It contained an exposed film. One frame, later dubbed frame number 33, was a shot with several intersecting light streaks. There are many theories about what this could have been, from film fogging to an optical effect. None of them have received definitive confirmation. All these elements are not fabricated. Some are officially documented. Some are based on the recollections and reports of the searchers. They are difficult to explain individually, but together they create an atmosphere of the unexplainable, one that leaves not only questions, but also the feeling that something more exists beyond the scope of the case than what we see in the protocols. The investigation into the incident began on February 27, 1959, immediately after the first bodies were discovered. It was led by Lev Ivanov, a prosecutor's investigator for Sverdlovsk Oblast. He had experience, but he had never encountered a case like this before. By order from Moscow, the case was placed under special control. Within days, representatives from the prosecutor's office, the KGB, and the military arrived at the scene. Everything that happened next was documented, but far from everything has been preserved. Autopsy reports were kept intermittently, sometimes with altered dates. For example, the same act might appear in different parts of the case with different timestamps. Some documents lack signatures. Some testimonies were later seized, and parts of the case remained inaccessible until the 1990s. Radiograms, which should have been recorded daily, are either missing or marked not for publication. Investigator Ivanov would later confess to me he was not allowed to complete the investigation according to his own scenario. According to him, when he began examining eyewitness testimonies about unusual light phenomena in the sky on the night of the tragedy, he was forbidden from continuing. In 1990, he published an article in which he explicitly wrote that he was pressured, and he believed the cause might have been something related to military technologies or atmospheric phenomena, but he was not permitted to verify this. The investigation report was closed on May 28, 1959. The conclusion was extremely vague. Death resulted from the action of an overwhelming force, without mentioning a specific cause or hinting at blame or error. Internal documents show that the investigation was quickly led to this conclusion, without further analysis. None of the experts were recalled. Protocols for repeat body examinations, which could have provided more information, were not conducted. After the case was closed, the area was temporarily restricted to tourists, unofficially, but for a long time. In the 1990s, when materials began to be declassified, researchers discovered that pages were missing in some places. Folders were not bound in order. In several places, numbers were marked that were not present in previous versions of the case. All this indicates that the case was edited, perhaps for ideological reasons, perhaps for reasons of state secrecy. When the official investigation failed to provide a clear answer, numerous theories emerged. Some were frankly fantastic, but there were also those built on facts, even if incomplete. One of the most persistent hypotheses is weapon testing. In February 1959, classified military experiments could indeed have been conducted in the northern Urals area. Several coincidences point to this. Firstly, R-12 missile overflights were recorded in the Ivdel and Vizay settlements. Secondly, in the same month, according to local residents, bright light phenomena resembling flashes were observed in the sky. They were described as fireballs moving at high speed. Documents obtained in the 1990s contain data on the testing of parachute mines, ordnance that leaves no crater but creates a powerful blast wave. Such a wave could have inflicted injuries similar to those sustained by Dubinina and Zolotaryov, internal damage without external wounds. The group's behavior also supports this theory. If they heard or saw something threatening, they might have rushed out of the tent without putting on clothes. Another theory is infrasound. This is a physical phenomenon where certain frequencies cause anxiety, disorientation, and panic in humans. Researchers proposed the hypothesis that a combination of the terrain of Kholat Syakhl mountain and strong winds could have caused infrasound resonance. People gripped by sudden fear might have panicked and fled their shelter, not understanding what was happening. But even if this explanation is accepted, it doesn't answer the main question. Where did such injuries come from? And why did it take so long to find the bodies? Yet another hypothesis is hidden witnesses. According to this, the tourists might have encountered people or an object that was not supposed to be seen. This could involve a military group or experimental equipment. This explains the possible interference with case materials, the absence of some protocols, and changes in records. However, like many similar theories, there is no direct evidence here, only circumstantial signs. There are also hypotheses related to a system error, for example, that the bodies were found earlier than indicated, but were temporarily removed from the site for examination or internal review. This explains inconsistencies in dates, confusion in protocols, and the strange positions of the bodies. This theory does not prove that the deceased were killed, but it suggests that the official investigation might have concealed not the cause, but the circumstances. Important. None of these theories are officially recognized, but each was born not from speculation, but from attempts to explain real facts. And when the official version, an overwhelming force, explains nothing, it is precisely such hypotheses that become tools for seeking the truth. Today, more than 60 years after the tragedy, interest in the Dyatlov case has not diminished. The reason is simple. Despite a large volume of information, it still lacks internal logic. And although many documents have been declassified, new data have not eliminated questions. On the contrary, they have only added to them. In the 2000s, a new wave of research began. Private individuals, journalists, and independent groups conducted dozens of expeditions to the pass. Weather conditions, slope topography, avalanche physics, and the tent's condition were studied. One such expedition showed that the slope on which the tent stood was too gentle for a classic avalanche to occur. Snow might have slid, but its volume would have been insufficient to cause such damage. This contradicts the version of the investigative committee, which was published in 2020. According to the official conclusion, the tourist died due to a localized slab avalanche, a small layer of snow that slid under its own weight. This theory explains the flight from the tent, but does not explain the nature of the injuries. None of the participants suffered bodily injuries typical of avalanches, such as asphyxiation, limb fractures, or ruptured lungs. Moreover, the tent remained in place, not torn or buried. This means the impact was uneven and partial. A reconstruction of the group's route was also carried out. Based on diaries and photographs, their path could be reconstructed almost day by day. They indeed followed their schedule, not deviating from the plan. This rules out the theory that they might have unknowingly entered a closed or forbidden zone. They followed an approved route, and no one suspected it would be their last. As for the investigative documents, some have been published since the 2010s, but key sections related to radio communications, internal directives, and military group actions are still either missing or kept in closed archives. Some protocols, both autopsies and body discovery reports, differ from each other. Researchers establish this by comparing copies from different years. Such discrepancies could not have been coincidental. In recent decades, digital modeling tools based on wind, snow, and temperature data have also appeared, but even they have not provided a definitive answer. For example, modeling the group's behavior showed that if they had left the tent due to an avalanche threat, they would most likely have stayed together and returned once it was safe. But in reality, they left and never returned. Something prevented them, something we still don't know. The story of Dyatlov Pass is a mystery that remains on Earth. And now I invite you to the sea. There, amidst the waves and fog, another peculiar image has lived for centuries. A ship that should not exist. It is called the Flying Dutchman. And the more I tell you about it, the less I understand what in this legend is fiction, and what is real, experienced fear. The legend of the Flying Dutchman emerged in maritime tradition in the 15th century, an era when European nations vied for trade routes, charted courses to India and Africa, and lost vessels daily in stormy waters. The very phrase Flying Dutchman is first mentioned in English-language sources in the 1790s, but the story's structure and content are much older. The name refers to Dutch mariners, among the most experienced and at the same time, most superstitious sailors of their time. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was a powerful maritime nation, with a strong fleet and active trade. It is through them, researchers believe, that the image entered English tradition, from where it spread worldwide. The first accounts of a strange ship that appeared suddenly, sailing against the wind and vanishing into the fog, began to be recorded by sailors passing the Cape of Good Hope, one of the most challenging and perilous stretches of the sea route between Europe and India. This cape had been considered a boundary between oceans since ancient times, and it was there that the Flying Dutchman was most frequently sighted. According to records, sailors did not consider it a figment of imagination. They mentioned it as a harbinger of misfortune. If you see the Flying Dutchman, expect a storm, a breakdown, illness, or death in the crew. It does not attack, it merely sails past, with sails full of a wind that isn't there. Some sources link the legend's origin to the image of a captain who violated divine or maritime laws. Some believe it was a curse for murder, others for a blasphemous oath. But in the earliest accounts, the captain's name was not mentioned. This would be added later, when the story took on the form of a literary plot. The most widely known version of the Flying Dutchman legend took shape closer to the 19th century. At the heart of this story is a captain named Van der Decken. He was Dutch, sailing a merchant vessel from the East Indies, and on his way to Europe, he attempted to round the Cape of Good Hope. A storm began. The wind snapped masts, waves crashed over the deck. The crew begged him to turn back, but the captain refused. According to legend, at that moment he cried out, "I will round this cape, even if I am doomed to sail forever." And it was this phrase that sealed his fate. The sea does not forgive such defiance. The storm did not subside and the ship vanished. Since then it seems to be stuck between worlds, continuing to sail the waves without approaching any shore. It is doomed to sail forever, and its crew with it. According to the myth, the Flying Dutchman sometimes tries to deliver letters to the living. Sailors see a longboat lowered from its side with a dead oarsman. Those who take the letter soon die. Sometimes it is simply seen in the distance. An old ship with tattered sails, sometimes glowing, and almost always during a storm, on the eve of misfortune. The exact origin of this story is unknown. Some researchers believe that the image of Van der Decken might have been inspired by a real captain who perished near the Cape in the 15th century, but his name is not found in historical sources. In other versions, the captain is not Dutch but Scottish, English, or even Spanish, but the name Dutchman stuck. Perhaps because in that era, the Dutch were renowned for their stubbornness at sea and courage bordering on madness. If we set aside the myth and turn to history, it turns out that mentions of the Flying Dutchman indeed appeared, not only in campfire tales, but also in official maritime logs. The earliest known written account dates to 1796. At that time, British sailors passing through the South Atlantic noted in their ship's log that they observed a ship sailing against the wind in the night mist. It vanished suddenly, without a sound. No one dared to explain what they had seen. The most famous incident occurred in 1881 when the Flying Dutchman was allegedly sighted by officers of the British fleet, including the future King George V, then a prince. According to the report, at dawn, one of the sailors saw the phantom ship in a crimson light, and soon after died in an accident. A record of this exists in HMS Bachant's logbook. What exactly they saw remains unclear to this day. There were more than a dozen similar reports. All of them came from the south, from the Cape of Good Hope, the South Atlantic, or the coast of Australia. The nature of the descriptions barely changed. An old sailing ship, a strange glow, movement against the wind, and an invariably unsettling feeling among the witnesses. Scientists attempted to explain the phenomenon. The most common theory is a mirage, known as fata morgana. Under specific conditions, air over water can create a distorted reflection of objects located beyond the horizon. Such an optical effect could have caused the illusion of a floating or translucent vessel. Another hypothesis is atmospheric refraction, where warm air lies over colder air and light refracts in a particular way. This can also create the image of a ship suspended in the air. But both mirages and refractions are rare occurrences. For them to happen with such frequency precisely in the vicinity of the Cape is highly improbable. Furthermore, not all reports were nocturnal. Some officers wrote about observations during clear weather in daylight, with good visibility. What it was, a physical phenomenon, a collective hallucination, or something else, remains unknown. Historians emphasize sailors in those times were observant people. They could read the sky, monitor the wind, and keep accurate records. Of course, superstitions at sea were strong, but that doesn't mean every mention of the Flying Dutchman is a figment of imagination. Perhaps something real lay behind these stories. We simply still don't know what exactly. Even if the ghost ship was never actually seen by anyone, the image of the Flying Dutchman itself proved so resilient that it demands an explanation. Why did sailors continue to believe in it even after scientific explanations emerged? Why did the stories repeat and the fear not disappear? Some researchers believe it was a collective way of coping with the unknown. The seas in the 17th and 19th centuries were territories of constant risk. Navigation was imprecise, weather unpredictable, and aid non-existent. Every voyage could be the last. In these conditions, superstitions not only maintained order on board, but also gave meaning to what would otherwise be perceived as chaos. Saw a ghost ship? It's not just a storm, it's a sign, which means one can prepare. There is another point of view. The Flying Dutchman is a symbol of guilt. A ship that cannot return, a captain who broke an oath, a crew who found no peace. Such an image appears not only in maritime tradition. In Japan, there are legends of boats with the dead appearing from the fog. In Norway, of ships without a captain carried by the wind. In China, of the souls of the drowned asking for a guide. All are connected to the anxiety when a deceased body does not return to shore. Some philosophers even see an archetype in this image. An eternal wanderer who has lost his way but not his purpose. He seems not to know that he died and continues to sail by inertia. This makes the Flying Dutchman not so much terrifying as sad. It is not malevolent, not dangerous. It is simply stuck. Thus, behind the maritime legend lies much more than just fear of a storm. It is a story about how a person loses their way and how the memory of this remains in culture. Over time, the Flying Dutchman ceased to be merely a maritime legend. It transitioned into literature, theater, music, and became a symbol, understandable even to those who had never been to sea. In the 19th century, this story gained new life through art, and it was then that the image finally became firmly established in European culture. One of the first to bring the phantom ship to the grand stage was the German composer Richard Wagner. His opera, The Flying Dutchman, written in 1843, presented a new hero, not a sinister ghost, but a man doomed to eternal wandering and awaiting liberation through love. It was not a horror story, but a romantic drama. the opera became incredibly popular, and from that moment, the image of the Flying Dutchman acquired a dual nature. On one hand, a maritime tale, on the other, a figure of tragic solitude. After Wagner, the theme appeared in literature. In the 19th century, it is found in the works of Heinrich Heine, Walter Scott, and Washington Irving. In various versions, the ship appears in a storm, sends signals, seeks help, or tries to break a curse. But the essence remains. It cannot stop. It sails not by will, but by necessity. By the early 20th century, the Flying Dutchman had become a steadfast image in the collective consciousness. It was known not only to sailors and readers, but also to artists, poets, and directors. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it appears in film, animation, comics, and games, from serious interpretations to parodies, but always as a symbol of something that exists but does not belong to the world of the living. For example, in the Pirates of the Caribbean films, the Flying Dutchman transforms into a death ship commanding the souls of deceased sailors. In other versions, it is a flying laboratory, an alien base, or a metaphor for a spiritual crisis, but in both, the ship remains isolated. It is on a journey but outside of time, and this is what makes it universal. Why is this legend so easily adaptable? Because it touches upon a common human fear, of being caught between life and death, between home and road, between beginning and end. We don't know what exactly the sailors saw off the Cape of Good Hope, but we know precisely what they felt. And it is that feeling of loneliness, aimless movement, the impossibility of return, that made the Flying Dutchman an eternal image. The next story is no less unsettling. This time, the disappearance occurred not in icy mountains, but on the open sea. It's a story not about a ship that dissolved into fog, but about people who vanished from a ship. The ship itself remained on the waves, empty, intact, completely functional. As if it waited for them to return, but they never did. This was the Mary Celeste, a vessel that became synonymous with an insoluble maritime mystery. The story of the Mary Celeste began even before she was named so. She was built in 1861 in Nova Scotia, Canada, and christened the Amazon. From the very beginning, the ship had ill luck. The first captain died within days of setting sail. On her maiden voyage, the vessel sustained serious damage. Over the next few years, the Amazon changed several owners, repeatedly ran aground, collided with other vessels, and in 1867 was sold to Americans. The new owner completely refitted the ship and gave her a new name, the Mary Celeste. She was a two-masted brig, about 31 meters long, designed for transporting cargo on transatlantic routes. Under the American flag, the ship completed several successful voyages, but her reputation remained strange. Sailors noted that the vessel behaved erratically, although technically everything was in order with her. Among sailors, the rumor took hold that the Mary Celeste brought bad luck. But for Captain Benjamin Briggs, this was a new chapter. He was an experienced navigator, respected in Boston and New York, and in 1872, he agreed to take command of this vessel. The ship was well equipped, received new cargo, and, as it seemed at the time, nothing portended disaster. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste departed from Staten Island, New York, bound for Genoa. On board was a cargo of approximately 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, intended for industrial use. The ship's captain was Benjamin Briggs, an experienced sailor, respected in American shipping circles. His family, wife Sarah and 2-year-old daughter Sophia, joined him for the voyage. In addition to them, there were 7 crew members on board, whom the captain had personally selected based on the experience of previous joint voyages. The weather on the day of departure was clear, the sea calm. The vessel left the harbor in good technical condition, supplied with provisions, drinking water, and everything necessary for a transatlantic crossing. For several weeks, the Mary Celeste sailed eastward, crossing the Atlantic, but she never reached her destination port. On December 4th, almost a month after departing, the ship was discovered adrift, crewless near the Azores. She was under sail with no apparent damage, but not a single person was found on board. On December 4, 1872, the brigantine Dei Gratia was sailing across the Atlantic approaching the Azores. Around noon, a lookout spotted a vessel moving on an erratic course. Captain David Morehouse ordered his ship to close in. He immediately recognized the name on the stern, Mary Celeste, this was surprising. He knew her captain, Benjamin Briggs, personally. They had communicated before departing from New York, and the Mary Celeste should have been far ahead. But the vessel did not respond. There were no signal flags, no flares, nothing. This seemed strange, given that the sails were partially set. After several unsuccessful attempts to get a response, Morehouse dispatched a boarding party. The sailors climbed aboard and immediately realized the vessel was empty. Neither the captain nor his family nor the crew, not a single person. Yet the vessel itself was not in a catastrophic state. Approximately a meter of bilge water was found in the hold. For an old wooden ship, this was considered acceptable. The sails were partially damaged. One bulwark was torn away, hatches were ajar, pumps were working. The logbook in the captain's cabin was kept up to November 25th. The entry was routine, without alarm. It indicated that the vessel was sailing past Santa Maria Island. Personal belongings were in place: clothes, luggage, even tools and provisions. There was enough food and water for at least a month. However, the chronometer, sextant, navigation tables, and the sole lifeboat were missing. These items were likely taken during an evacuation attempt. There were no signs of struggle, panic, or storm. Everything looked as if the crew had left voluntarily, but offered no explanation. The vessel was in such a state that it was decided to take it under tow. Captain Morehouse ordered it to be delivered to Gibraltar for an official investigation. Upon the arrival of the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar on December 12, 1872, an official investigation was launched. An inspection of the vessel confirmed that its condition allowed for continued sailing. Of the cargo, 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol. 9 barrels had leaked. There were no signs of external interference. Personal belongings of the crew members, including clothing and documents, remained on board. The captain's logbook was in his cabin and contained the last entry from November 25th, made near the Azores. There were sufficient provisions and fresh water on the ship. No signs of struggle or emergency damage were found. However, the sextant, chronometer, navigation tables, rudder log, and the sole lifeboat were missing. This could indicate an attempt at an organized evacuation. As a result of the inspection, the Commission was unable to determine a definitive reason for the crew's disappearance. The reports did not record any traces indicating violent acts, internal conflict, or external attack. After the arrival of the Mary Celeste in Gibraltar on December 12, 1872, and her placement under the custody of port authorities, an official investigation was initiated. It was led by Fred Soliflut, an Admiralty representative and lawyer. During the preliminary inquiry, various hypotheses were considered, including pirate attack, mutiny on board, and deliberate abandonment of the vessel for insurance purposes. The crew of the Dei Gratia, which discovered the Mary Celeste and brought her to port, underwent thorough interrogation. Unofficial publications that appeared in newspapers and private correspondence put forward additional assumptions not considered by the court: the effect of alcohol fumes, sudden panic among the crew, a pirate attack, or a natural phenomenon. However, these hypotheses were not included in the investigation materials. The Commission concluded the vessel was abandoned for an unknown reason, unrelated to external violence or shipwreck. Hearings on the Mary Celeste case took place in the Gibraltar Admiralty Court in December 1872 and continued until February of the following year. The commission was presided over by the aforementioned Fred Soliflut, who served as Crown Advocate. The proceedings centered on 2 key questions: the legality of the Dei Gratia crew's claim for salvage compensation for the Mary Celeste, and the establishment of the circumstances of her crew's disappearance. The testimonies of Captain David Morehouse and his crew members were deemed consistent and logical. Nevertheless, Soliflut showed suspicion, suggesting the possibility of collusion despite the lack of evidence. During the trial, data on the vessel's technical condition, its cargo, navigational records, and order on board were presented. The ship's inspection confirmed the absence of damage characteristic of an attack, as well as the preservation of property. In light of insufficient evidence of criminal intent, the court recognized the salvage claim as legitimate. However, the amount of compensation was significantly reduced. Instead of the expected share of the cargo's value, the Dei Gratia crew received only about 1/6 of the potential sum, £3,000 sterling instead of 15,000. The court's decision emphasized that the actions of the Dei Gratia crew in delivering the abandoned vessel to port deserved compensation, but it did not exclude the possibility that the Mary Celeste was abandoned due to error or misjudgment of the situation. The disappearance of Captain Briggs, his family and crew was officially recorded as unexplained. With this, the legal part of the case concluded. We've just been on the open ocean on an empty ship, and now I invite you ashore to a story that still clutches my heart with its merciless mystery. This isn't the disappearance of one person or a single detachment. This is the vanishing of an entire colony, people with families, tools, hopes for the future. They built homes, planted crops, and then they just disappeared. Every single one of them. No bodies, no notes, not a single trace remained. Only one word carved into a tree, Roanoke, the late 16th century. Europe was entering the age of discovery. England, observing the successes of Spain and Portugal, sought to establish a foothold in the New World. In 1584, Sir Walter Raleigh received a patent from Queen Elizabeth to establish a colony in North America. The first expeditions landed on the coast of modern North Carolina on Roanoke Island, located off the Pamlico Sound. But these were merely reconnaissance groups. A permanent settlement was established later in the summer of 1587. The expedition was led by John White, an experienced cartographer and traveler. More than 100 people accompanied him. Men, women, and children. Among them were his daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. It was in this colony, already on American soil, that a girl named Virginia Dare was born. The first child of English descent born in the New World. The colonists named the settlement the City of Raleigh, but it would more often be simply referred to as Roanoke, after the island. Initially, everything proceeded relatively smoothly. People landed, built homes, and created gardens. They relied on support from the mother country, but from the outset, they faced resource shortages, tensions with local tribes, and uncertainty about the future. It was against this backdrop that Governor White made the difficult decision to return to England to fetch provisions, weapons, and new directives from the Crown. The plan was simple: to return with supplies by the following spring, but England at that time was already preparing for war. The threat of invasion from Spain quickly escalated into a mobilization of the entire fleet. In the summer of 1588, the Spanish Armada's campaign began. All suitable ships, merchant, cargo, even private ones, were requisitioned for defense needs. John White desperately tried to leave the country, but his ships either refused to set sail or were diverted to other missions. It was only almost 3 years later, in 1590, that he finally managed to get back to Roanoke, a delay that proved fatal. The journey was difficult. Part of the crew refused to sail to the end. Twice they were hit by severe storms, and only at the end of the month did a small group, including White himself, land on Roanoke Island. What he saw defied explanation. The settlement was ruined, houses dismantled, fences removed. There were no signs of battle, fire, or panic. Everything looked as if it had been deliberately abandoned, yet too thoroughly. The graves White had left on the site were disturbed, possibly by animals. No ships were visible, no trace of a boat, no sound of voices. All that remained was a carving on a tree. On one trunk, the word CROATOAN was carved on another. The fragment Crow. There were no maps, no diaries, no other inscriptions. And most importantly, there were no crosses that the colonists had promised to leave in case of distress. This absence of a distress signal alarmed White. He hypothesized that the settlers might have voluntarily relocated to the neighboring Hatteras Island, which was sometimes called CROATOAN, after the local tribe. However, the attempt to reach there ended in failure. A storm forced the ship to weigh anchor and leave the shore. There would be no opportunity to return. Winter was approaching, and the expedition's resources were running out. John White would never see his daughter, granddaughter, or any of those left behind. This would be the end of his personal story and the beginning of the most renowned colonial mystery in British history. The inscription left on the tree was the only lead. The word CROATOAN at that moment did not evoke fear or panic in John White. On the contrary, it pointed to a possible direction for the search. The colonists had heard this name before. The CROATOANs were considered relatively peaceable. and there had been earlier attempts to establish contact between them and the English. This was not a random trace, but perhaps a pre-agreed marker. At any rate, White interpreted it as such. According to the recollections of the first expedition's participants, the CROATOANs could indeed be relied upon. Unlike the hostile CROATOAN tribe, this tribe accepted the British without open resistance. But how exactly to interpret the inscription was unclear. Was it the name of an island, a people, a place, or something else? No date, no details. White could not know how long ago the carving had been left, or if those who made it were still alive. He planned to go to CROATOAN but could not. There was little food and water left on the ship. A storm raged, and the crew refused to take the risk. This was the last attempt to find out something. Neither he nor anyone else of his time ever reached the neighboring island to verify his hunch. After some time, White returned to England and never undertook new expeditions. More than 400 years have passed since the colony's disappearance, and throughout this time, the question, what happened to the people of Roanoke, has remained open. During the 19th and 20th centuries, sporadic attempts were made to ascertain their fate, but it was only in the 20th century that full-fledged scientific investigations began. Historians were most interested in two areas: Roanoke Island itself, where the colony vanished, and Hatteras Island, the very CROATOAN where, according to White's assumption, the settlers might have relocated. In the first half of the 20th century, archaeologists began excavations on both islands. In the area of the supposed settlement on Roanoke, remains of fortifications, charred planks, and pottery fragments were found. All of this clearly dated to the 16th century. However, nothing indicating a tragedy or violent disappearance was discovered. No signs of battle, no mass casualties, no destruction that could explain the vanishing of an entire group of people. More intriguing discoveries awaited researchers to the south on Hatteras Island. In the 1990s and 2000s, artifacts were found there that are presumed to have belonged either to the colonists themselves or to those who interacted with them. Among the findings are an Elizabethan-era ring, iron tools, and European ceramics. Some items were buried at a depth consistent with the late 16th century. Archaeologists from the First Colony Foundation suggested that at least part of the group might have indeed relocated to the CROATOAN tribe and been integrated into their community. This explains the absence of signs of violence. There was no conflict, no struggle. They simply left, however. Archaeological evidence, however, remains circumstantial. Artifacts could have been brought later through exchange, trade, or by chance. The scientific consensus today is cautious. There is insufficient evidence that the vanished Roanoke colony specifically resided on Hatteras. But this line of research remains the most promising. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony spawned dozens of theories. Some were rational, others mystical, and some balanced between fact and fantasy. As early as the 17th century, rumors circulated among the settlers inhabiting the coast of Virginia and Carolina. Allegedly Native Americans with gray eyes and light skin lived deep inland. These stories became the basis for assumptions that the colonists were accepted into tribes and assimilated over time. Some anthropologists even attempted to find genetic or cultural traces of English presence among the descendants of local tribes, for example, in their language, dwelling architecture, or daily life. However, no convincing evidence of this has yet been obtained. Another group of theories relates to forced evacuation. There could have been shortages of fresh water, crop failures, or diseases. The colony, cut off from England, might have been unable to withstand the environmental pressures and independently left the settlement. There is little confirmation for this theory either, but it explains why there are no signs of struggle or destruction. Less likely, but still mentioned in documents, is the theory of a hostile attack. Some historians believe that the CROATOAN tribe might have attacked the settlers. However, there are no archaeological traces, no bones, no weapons, no signs of violence. Even the tribes themselves, with whom English missionaries and colonists later interacted, did not speak of killings. At most, they mentioned that white people might have lived among them. Finally, frankly fantastical ideas began to appear in the popular consciousness. The lost colony was written about as a subject of a curse, with theories emerging about ritual sacrifices, ghost ships, or time itself having taken the settlement. These plots were often used in novels, films, and even TV shows. The most cautious position of modern researchers is this. The most probable scenario is partial assimilation with neighboring tribes, possibly on Hatteras Island or further inland. The remaining settlers might have died from diseases or attempted to relocate but did not survive. Due to the absence of remains, inscriptions, and written sources, no single version can be considered definitive. This is why the story of Roanoke remains not just an episode of early colonization, but a true mystery based on facts, documents, and real people whose fate still sparks debate.